In our research laboratory here at Gallaudet College, we have been using the equipment you see behind me in some tests to determine how hearing impaired persons can discriminate different kinds of sound. The reason why we are doing this research is because we feel that very little is known about the sound discrimination ability of persons with moderate, severe, and profound deafness. We know that it is fairly easy in the clinic for an audiologist to get a general idea of how well a person can discriminate the sounds in speech by giving him a speech discrimination test. But we really do not find, when we do such a test, any detailed information about what sounds in the speech the hearing impaired person can discriminate, what ones sound about right to him, and what sounds he is not able to discriminate. Now, we feel it would be very important to know more about the sound qualities in speech that are being heard correctly by people with impaired hearing, and those qualities which are not heard correctly. Now, the reason that we think this information is very important are two reasons, really. One, we feel that the teacher of deaf and hearing impaired persons would be able to teach better and know how to choose her teaching material better if she had more knowledge of what sounds in her speech are intelligible and discriminable to her pupils, and what sounds are not being discriminated by them. The second reason is that if the auditory therapist who wants to carry out auditory training to improve speech reception for persons with deaf ears, if this therapist knew more about the sound discriminating capacities of her patients, she would be able to do better auditory training with these people. So here in our laboratory, what we have done is to carry out some special types of discrimination tests to try to explore the detailed discrimination capacity of persons, primarily those with moderate to severe sensorineural deafness. Behind me here, you see the equipment which generates and controls special synthetic sounds that are similar to speech sounds for special discrimination tests. In the room next to this control room, a deaf person listens to the sounds generated in the test and makes a response to describe how well he can discriminate these sounds. So the sound controls are here, and in one type of test, we present to the listener in the next room 3 sounds on each trial in the test. One of the sounds is different from the other 2 sounds in its sound quality, and his task is to tell us which one of the 3 sounds was different by pushing a button to give us his response. Now I'm going to turn on the 3 sounds, the sounds are generated by this part of our equipment here, and we look. There, you heard the three sounds, and the first sound was different from the other two. Now we'll hear three more sounds. On those three, the second sound was different from the other two. So the listener tells us which one of the three he thinks was the different one. And then the program is arranged so that we find through a succession of trials how small we can make this difference before he is not able to discriminate it. So on the first trial, a very large difference like the one you just heard is given to the listener, and if he's correct, then the programmer here behind me automatically makes the difference smaller on the next trial. If he's correct on that trial, the difference is again made smaller on the following trial, and so on. And we do a run of trials somewhat like this. On this chart, I have shown how the difference is made smaller and smaller, and each X here represents the difference on one trial in the test. So this is the first trial. He got that correct. So the difference was made smaller on the second trial. He got that correct. And the difference was made smaller again. He got that wrong, so the difference was made larger again. He got that correct. Then he got a whole succession of trials correct here, and then began to kind of oscillate for a while, but then he got some more correct here, and finally ended up way down here, and we call this the threshold for his hearing of this difference. Now this subject on this run of trials reached a rather small threshold, so his discrimination for this change in the sound quality was quite fine. Now here we have another subject who got some correct on the first trials, but then he oscillated in this region where the difference was much larger on each trial than for this subject. So we try to find the smallest difference that a subject can discriminate in this test, and use that as the measure of his discrimination capacity. If he requires a large difference, we say his discrimination is rather poor. If he requires a small difference, his discrimination is much better. Now, I would like to show you some of the results of these tests. This graph shows some of the results of the format discrimination test, which you just heard. The amount of difference that is necessary for discrimination is plotted vertically here, and if that amount is high, discrimination is poor. If the amount of format difference is smaller, then discrimination is better. The results are plotted in time along this way as the listeners had more and more listening experience in the experiment. Each point here, of course, tells us the total number of determinations of the threshold that was made up to that time in the experiment by the listeners. There are three groups of listeners whose results are plotted here. A group with very severe hearing loss at 1,000 cycles, about 88 or 89 dB of loss. Another group of sensorineural impaired listeners with less hearing loss, having a loss of about 75 dB at 1,000 cycles. And then down here, a group of normal listeners. Now, you'll notice that, first of all, that the listeners with the more severe loss have larger thresholds for hearing the format frequency difference than the sensorineural group with less loss, and that both of these groups require much larger difference, especially in the early part of the experiment, than normals to hear the format frequency difference. Now, you notice, though, that as the experiment goes on, both of the sensorineural impaired groups get better in their discrimination. They can hear smaller and smaller format frequency differences. And that the group with the more severe hearing loss takes longer and learns a little bit more slowly than the group with the better hearing. After they'd had 8 to 10 runs, were doing sometimes almost as good as normal. But you notice that their performance is rather variable from time to time. We don't know exactly what this variation is due to. Now, I think that there are some important things to say about these results in relation to auditory training problems. When you want to train a person to make a speech-sound discrimination, this tells us that if he has a severe to profound sensory neural loss, that we should expect that if his loss is very severe, that he may require a rather long training time to improve his discrimination. And that even so, sometimes when discrimination gets fairly good, that we will find periods of inconsistency, and when discrimination is not as good as it was before. Now, if the auditory training therapist knows that these long training is necessary and that results sometimes may appear to be inconsistent, that you're getting nowhere or worse, then she's more likely to carry on the training further until stable results are achieved. So we feel that we have some important relations here and effects that will be important in instructing teachers and auditory training therapists. Now I want to describe to you a different kind of test which we are using to measure the discrimination for hearing impaired persons. In these tests, we try to test a discrimination for a part of the sound which we think is related to consonant discrimination. In the test that I described to you before, the format frequencies were steady at the same frequency location throughout each sound in the group of 3 sounds on a trial. This kind of discrimination we feel may be related to vowel discrimination in impaired listeners. But the consonants of speech are very important to be able to discriminate. And so we have arranged our equipment to make a discrimination test that will be related to consonant discrimination. For one of the cues used by normal listeners for discriminating consonants are the transitions in the formant frequency locations. So when the formant moves from one frequency location to another due to consonant articulation, this transition in the formant frequency is heard by a normal listener and enables him to tell the different consonants from each other. So we here in our laboratory have arranged so that we can do a test for discriminating a change in formant frequency, or as we call it, a transition in the formant frequency, and measure the ability of hearing impaired persons to hear these formant frequency changes. Our test sequence is very much like the one for the previous test. But now the listener listens for a change in formant frequency instead of a difference like he did before. On the three sounds in each trial, two of the sounds have no change in their formant frequency, and the third sound has a transition during the sound in the location of the formant frequency. Now I think you can hear this if I play some examples for you. The transitions in formant frequency are generated down here. Now that was the number 2 sound on that group that had the change in the formant frequency. In that group, number 2 again was the sound that had the transition in the formant frequency. That was number 1 sound. Now I would like to go to my office and I will show you some of the results of this test. These two pictures here show spectrograms of the sounds that were used in the test for discrimination of transitions in the format of a synthetic sound. This is a transition in the format here in this sound. The sound lasted about 1/2 of a second, and the transition goes from 2,000 cycles for the formant frequency to 3,000 cycles. Here on the left is a similar sound where there is no transition in the formant frequency. The formant is at 3,000 cycles throughout the sound duration. The duration of the transition, or the speed of the transition here, is rather slow. The duration is rather long, about 300 milliseconds, or 3/5 of the whole sound. And we changed this speed in some of the experiments to find out the effect of the speed of the transition of formant frequency. Now, the tests were arranged just like the ones before. At the start of the test, a large transition from 2,000 to 3,000 cycles was used, and if the listener heard correctly which one of the 3 sounds on the test had the transition, then on the next trial, the transition started at a frequency a little bit closer to the 3,000 cycle end frequency, we call it. If he's correct on that, then on the next trial, the transition starts a little bit closer yet to 3,000 cycles, and we continue just like we did before to find how close the transition, how small a transition we can have, and the listener can still tell which one of the 3 sounds has the transition in the format. Now here are some of the results from these tests. We have in the graph plotted the discrimination threshold, again from low thresholds or very fine discriminations or small amount of formant transition to higher amounts of formant transition that were necessary to hear the occurrence of the transition. Horizontally, we have plotted the duration of the transition on the particular test. This duration was always the same on one run of tests. The short durations are somewhat like the formant transitions that occur in stop consonants, and the longer transitions here at 100 milliseconds are somewhat like the transitions that occur on glide-type consonants like wa and ya. Then the long transitions are like those that occur in the diphthongs in vowels. And these very long transitions throughout almost the whole duration of the sound, 500 milliseconds long, are much longer than those that naturally occur in speech. We have results for listeners with severe sensorineural losses divided into two types of listeners. Those whose loss has a sloping contour on the audiogram we call sloping losses. We had 3 listeners in that category. Then in the other category of sensorineural loss, 3 people with rather flat contours in their audiograms. In other words, they had about an equal hearing loss at all frequencies in the audiogram. Then we had a group of normal listeners in the test here. Well, you can see that the persons with sloping losses require larger amounts of formant transition before they can hear a transition than do these persons with flat hearing losses, and that both of these groups require larger amounts of formant transition than normals in order to hear the occurrence of the transition. And you will also notice that the normal listeners require a larger transition if the duration of the transition is very short, but this is also true of the impaired listeners, and perhaps even to a greater extent require very large transitions for these very short 50 millisecond transition sounds. Now, we feel that with experiments of this kind, where we can really explore the details of what a person with impaired discrimination can discriminate, and we have sounds changes to be discriminated, which we feel are very important to the normal listener to enable him to differentiate the different sounds of speech. So when we have quite a bit of information from research of this type, we think we will have a much better description of what a speech discrimination impairment is like. And when we have such a description, we believe that we will be able to design better types of hearing aids. We'll be able to tell auditory training therapists and teachers of the deaf what kinds of speech discriminations may be usable to them, to their pupils and their trainees, and what kinds of discriminations may be very, very difficult.